I'm Anne von Wiese. Today I'm going to show you a little bit about attaching some feathers to hats as well as styling. I'm just going to go over some of the methods that I've found over the years that have been useful for me creating some pretty complex feather arrangements. If you've ever put a feather in a hat before, it can be pretty difficult, especially if you're just trying to do it with pins. But if you're trying to do a time period such as Europe in the 16th century, then suddenly feathers come into play. So since I do early 16th century Holy Roman Empire reenactment, I have kind of worked on a lot of hats over the years and developed some methods for doing it. None of my methods that I use for attaching hats are necessarily like historically accurate. I haven't done heavy, like research into methods that would be used, but my premise is that I'm using a lot of techniques that would have been available at the time. So it's not like I'm using something that is modern. Most of the time I'm going to be using a needle and thread to achieve the desired look. And also the methodology that I'm showing, I'll show you several different ways. And I'm not the inventor of any of these. I've just perfected my own methodology for doing it. And in my linked blog article there in the chat, you can go and visit some other creators that have expanded on this or done different things. And it's always good for more information. Primarily, I will focus on how to get the feather into the hat, and then also some styling ideas as well. The particular focus is for cloth hats, wool hats of like late 15th, early 16th century. So because that's kind of what I focus on, so I tend to be myopic, but a lot of these techniques could be applied to other periods and regions depending. So first, I'm just going to start with the feathers, talking about feathers a little bit. Is when I'm talking about feathers, usually I'm talking about ostrich feathers, and ostrich feathers come in a lot of flavors. You have something like this, which is a natural long wing feather here. And you can see it has a lot of bounce to it. It has a real pretty drape naturally on its own. I really like the multiple colors. These are a lot of fun to work with, especially if you're doing like, say, female German early 16th century, they tended to they didn't necessarily have as many colorful plumes. So these are a great option for hats like that. So that's a wing type feather. It's longer and it has this beautiful drape to it. And then you have your drabs, which are cheaper and also nice to use, but you can see they don't quite have the same flop to the barbs. So feather anatomy real quick. This is the shaft or the rachis, and then your quill end. These are the barbs, and the little cross parts of the feather is the barblets. And so that's what can cause, like on a flighted animal, the barblets will go together finely, but since this is an animal that doesn't fly, they don't need to. So it's a really pretty. As in my article, you can get the link from there. I go to Swalif and Sons, and I like them because they're out of California. So I know that there's, I know where they're at. I'm familiar with them. The problem is that they're wholesale. So either you get somebody to go in with you, or you end up with a large amount of feathers like me and able to feather all future hats that you could ever think of forever. So I think I spent $100 on feathers and I will never have to purchase a feather again. So that's my supplier who I trust and I like. I trust their practices. However, if you are looking for something that is humane, there are farms that do provide feathers from animals that you know are still alive. So if that's a concern of yours, if you're looking for a vegan option, I would look for a farm that sources their feathers that way. And there are available. They're just going to be more expensive, but be aware, that I'm not, I don't know how humanely sourced these are, but that's who I use. So that being said, you might not want $100 worth of feathers. Find a group of people. So that's a large drab. And then you have smaller drabs like this. And this is a natural small drab, which you might think is pretty boring. You might see this in a feather duster, which I have used a feather duster in a pinch before and stole the feathers out of it. So this is just a nice small little drab, which looks kind of boring, but if you apply some styling methodology that was employed at the time, you can make these a lot of fun. But and when it comes to hats, there's also things like rooster feathers that you might be using, or even peacock or pheasant feathers, depending on the region and the history of the time, what would be used. So definitely, but primarily today, I'm going to be discussing ostrich feathers, but a lot of these can be applied to other feathers. Usually when I'm just getting started, my suggestion is to plan the arrangement. And if you're dealing with a hat where you're putting 1 or 2 feathers, it's not a big deal. But if you're dealing with a hat where you're going to put in 20 feathers, it's important to plan it out. So I will often put a hat just on a mannequin first and get an idea of what I might like to do. Pick out the particular feathers. I have my demonstration hat here. So I'll be using this hat for my demos just because it's nice and easy to see. So before I get started, I might start by placing my feathers on the hat, getting an idea of what feathers I want to use, what is the final look, placing them, maybe even ordering them dependent on what I'm doing. So keep that in mind. So one of the first methods I'm going to talk about is just straight pinning. And I think most people who have ever wanted to have a feather in their cap are familiar with that. So you can just take a pin and you can just directly pin it into your cap with no fanfare, which for one is fine. But what happens when you're dealing with, say, children or with somebody who might be touched? Or if you're like me, you are dealing with a lot of feathers and then you're poking yourself in the head, which has happened. It's not pleasant. So generally, I only use a pinning method if it's for an adult and I know that it's 1 or 2 feathers and it's going to be in one spot and they can manage that. I might even cover the end with a bead or a pencil eraser works as well. If I was going to be just doing pinning it in, just to make sure nobody was injured by the pen. But a lot of people use pins for their method of putting it in, but I'm not a big fan. So over time, I've kind of developed a way that I deal with feathers, and I actually will sew and then tie them in. I, over time, developed a way where I take and I will create ties on a feather before I apply these. And so I'm going to show you first how to create the tie attachments to your feathers to tie into your hat first. So I start doing that by just picking out, and this works best for larger feathers. If you had a particularly small feather, like say something like this, you're not going to be able to pierce the shaft of this feather without cracking it. So I recommend this for medium to larger feathers. And so all you have to do is take your feather. Let me find one I haven't done before. And I will pre-prep my feathers by doing this. Once I've planned my arrangement, I'll pick out a really large needle to make sure that I don't break it. But you want to make sure you pick out a needle that's appropriate, not too big for the shaft, not too small. So you want to pick something out appropriately. And I use upholstery thread. You could also use heavy linen if you like. I would heavily wax it to protect it from the elements to make sure it didn't degrade over time. And all you're going to do, I generally don't push off on it myself, but I'll hold it. And you're going to pick 2 points. Generally for a large feather, I pick 2 points, one toward the quill end and a bit up the shaft. This is going to allow you to control the angle of the feather after you put it into the hat. So, and all you'll do is just go through, right through the shaft or rachis and pull that right through. And now you have tie points. And I'm going to leave this really long and I'm going to go make another one. Consider over time, you start to pay attention to things like the angle of your feather. like what angle am I, because I've planned out my arrangement, right? So now I might adjust the way that I create my tie points based upon how I know I'm going to be attaching it to the hat. So I'm going to pull that through. I now have 2 long tie points attached to my feather. And I'm going to tie them off to the shaft to make sure they don't slip out. And I can reuse these over and over again. This is not necessarily, I leave them long so I could do it again and again. I do tie it kind of around it just to kind of finish it off, and then I'll tie it. You have to forgive me, my fingers a bit numb. And I'll create 2 point tie points. Now, if I was dealing with an extremely long wing feather, I might even create a third. And I do mention that in the diagram on my blog site. So now I have 2 nice tie points for my feather to attach to the hat. So that's one of the main methods that I use for dealing with larger feathers. I'm going to create, and you might think, well, that can end up being a lot of ties, and it can. But if you're creating a complex arrangement, you want your feathers to stand. These are expensive. You don't want to lose them. And you also want to hold up against the weather. Like I can get hit by a good blast of wind and I will not lose my hat. So you leave about 6 inches or more of this upholstery thread or heavy thread left on your, you're going to cut those or tie those later. But I'm going to just leave those on, and that now this feather is prepped to use later. Now, what happens though, this works for larger to medium feathers, like I said, and paying attention to not cracking the feathers. Keep in mind that if you do crack it, push through, tie it off, it's still going to work. It's not ruined. And you'll find that older feathers tend to be more brittle. You can kind of dip them and soak them a little bit in water. It does make them softer. So those are something to keep in mind. I did one time receive a haul of feathers from a somebody's garage sale, and they were very brittle, but I was able to use them no problem. So keep that in mind, that you want to pay attention to how thick your feather is, how soft it is. That's all going to come into play when you're attaching threads like this. So what happens if you have a broken feather and you still want to create an arrangement with these smaller feathers that you can't pierce the shaft? Another method that I use is where I take some sort of wool felt or regular felt. I just happen to have a lot of wool felt scraps, and you can either sew or glue that to the end of your feather, creating a really nice base for attachment. So I will take a small piece of felt like this, and I'm going to encase the shaft or on the quill end with this little piece of felt to hold on to the feather so that I could attach it later. So I'm going to take the same good size needle so that you don't break it. You know, wear a thimble or push off with some leather, whatever works best for you. And so this feather would be too small necessarily to create tie points, and also could end up being a lot of feathers. Or if it was really brittle, you also might want to do this. So instead of just tying it off, I'm going to take and I'm going to wrap it with this felt to add some protection. I am still going to try to pierce the shaft a little bit, at least in 2 spots, just to add an extra grab to it. See, I pulled it through right there. But this will provide protection for the base of the feather so that it doesn't crack, as well as create a nice, secure, flat tie point. And now that I've gone through one time through the shaft, I'm just going to go and sew up along, creating a channel for the feather. And I'm kind of rushing along to keep it going, so not making the most beautiful of stitches, but it doesn't really have to be perfect. And I'm going to go one more time. I'm going to try to go through the shaft one more time. And I just happened to have done this a lot, so I knew that shaft of this feather could take this particular needle. So you'll have to kind of, if you're trying this at home, you might want to experiment with it before damaging any of your feathers, because they can be quite expensive. So then I would just tie this off, you know, like a normal sewing tie. But now I've created, look at that, I've created this really nice base that will hold this feather in, and also creates a nice flat attachment point to my hat, which also helps me control the direction of the feathers. So if you've ever wondered, when you've seen these arrangements that are standing straight up, these are some of the ways to achieve those looks without your feather falling or going down sideways. So that's attaching a base. So you might not want to sew, you might want to use a glue, and you can, in the time appropriate, you might find like some sort of pelt glue or something like that to use, or and you can create a glue and actually just glue. This was done with pelt glue, where I just glued it in. And so now I have this nice little base that it's been glued in on. And now I could just attach that to the hat and sew in this little base directly without losing my feather. So the thing to keep in mind though with glue, and I'll talk about this more in the next section, is you want to be careful, because if you use too much, you can create a real hard spot. The pelt glues tend to maintain some elasticity, so they're not too bad, but they can be hard to poke through. So if you ever deal with glue, craft glue and hot glue also work. So you don't necessarily have to go with a pelt glue. Now you've got these two ways of attaching feathers. And now I'm going to talk about one more situation. What do you do if you're dealing with something like a rooster feather? How are you going to attach this to your hat when you can't pierce the shaft without breaking it or potentially hurting yourself? So you can actually sew these into, I usually use bias tape, but you could, whatever you like to use. I will sew these directly in to the tape. I'll just take each feather and then carefully sew each one in nice and snug so that they're set into this tape. You can then attach this tape to your hat any way you desire. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways to attach it here in a second, but this could be pinned or sewn directly into the hat. And so how I would do that is I always keep a lot of bias tape just kind of on hand. And I would use bias tape for this because it has some give to it, especially if you're trying to shape it into a hat. It can be very nice. So you're just going to take your two feathers, do slightly bigger. You're going to take your feather arrangement, put your feathers in there in the desired pattern every inch, or whatever density you're looking at. And I'm going to sandwich it in between the two and then just sew the feathers directly in. This time, instead of using that larger upholstery needle, I'm going to downsize my needle size because I don't need something quite that meaty. Yeah, downsize your needle so it's a nice smaller needle, because I'm still going to at least pierce the quill end of the shaft or rackus at least once and come through. And then I'm just going to stitch. Usually I stitch several running stitches down the length as I do multiple ones, but you can just come up the side and you create this little, almost like a trim tape of your feathers yourself. And then this can be applied. Oh, this can be applied. I didn't tie it off. This can be then applied to your hat. So I'm going to go through the shaft at the quill end at least once, because if not, it might slip out between the channels that you create by sewing. So I do like sandwiching it at least once with that in there, but it doesn't have to be all up along. It can just be one time is usually enough to create the hold that you're looking for. So by the time you get done, you end up with something like that, where you have multiple feathers snugly sewn into a tape that, and because it's bias tape, it now bends, so you can then apply that to your hat however you desire. So in some of my drawings on my blog page, you can see like how I might attach multiple poof feathers to a very large round hat using this method. So that's another method that I use for attaching small feathers. So again, it brings up the pellet glue. So again, that's another option, that if you wanted to just use a glue, such as a pellet glue, to glue them directly in. The problem is as you can imagine, when the pellet glue or glue gets on fabric, it tends to get really hard and can be quite immovable and hard to attach to something. So you have to be very mindful if you decide to use glue to attach your feathers into a tape, because before you know it, you have, you're no longer able to attach that to anything else because you can't pierce it to attach it to your hat. So it is available, it is an option, but be wary and test when you use glue. So now I've told you about these methods for creating attachment points on your feathers, creating ties that tie in directly for large feathers, creating little attachment felt base points for your smaller feathers, or creating feathered tape that you can then apply to a hat. So now what? What do you do with this? If you're not just going to pin it in, well, pinning is still an option. If you had something really simple and you weren't going to do anything else, you might just pin that in and be ready to go. But usually I'm doing something pretty complicated and I don't want it to come out. I don't want to lose my feathers because I've paid a lot of money for them, number one. And number two, next thing you know, you've got feathers all over the place. So I like to attach them more securely and use some of the attachment points I discussed earlier. So how to do it? So one of the methods in which I do is I just tie by stitching the attachment strings directly into the hat. And the direction you attach these will be dictated by your overall style and what you planned earlier when you kind of planned out the style of your hat. And I have my little demo hat here to use so that you guys can see it better. When I talk about it, this is the brim. This is what I call, I don't know the technical term for this. I kind of call it like where the hat band would be. So like the articulation point between the crown and the brim of the hat. So I might call it the band area. And it's that point at which the under part of the crown meets with the top part of the brim. So generally you're attaching feathers here to achieve your look. And depending on what style you have will dictate. Sometimes there's hats where it's not a horizontal situation. It's actually turned up like this. So you're going to have to be aware of what kind of hat and what ultimate look you're going with. This has a little bit of a flat cap version to it. And so you can just sew the feathers in directly. So I'd take a needle from earlier and thread that. And I'll use my ties that I created earlier, my little tie off points on my feather. And I'm going to start with the one closest to the quill end of the feather. And I'm going to attach, generally, I attach those right at the band point, the base next to the head. And this is if I'm going for a feather that's going to stick straight back or straight out the side or come all the way around the head. I'll just keep going. And then I'll shape each feather after I put them all in. So I'm going to attach that in here. And I'm just going to pull it through. This hat currently is not lined. So some hats, I do this after it's lined because I know I might be changing it later and I want to have access to feathers. But if I know I'm going to never change the feather location again, I might do it before I've lined it. So normally the way I make my hats, I would attach a lining to this and then it will roll back up into the hat. So there's no lining in this. This is just the band on the inside where I would attach my liner. So I just pull that through. I get both strings. I do them separately, not that far apart, maybe like they're spaced maybe a fourth of an inch apart. If not right, pretty darn close, but you want to make sure it bites into the fabric enough. It's kind of a little hard to see, but they're right there, right near each other. And I'm going to push that one through. And so now I have two strings coming through to the other side. And now if I was to tie this off with a kissing knot, or even while you're still planning a loopy bow, that you'll later go back and turn to a knot, you can start planning out your arrangement. And as you can see, that feather, it's not going anywhere now. It will stay on the hat. And that's one nice thing about this method is you can get hit by wind, you can get any number of caught in a doorway and your hat will remain intact, a little worse for wear, but still intact. So these strings that I brought through to the other end, I might, while I'm planning, sometimes I just create a big loopy bow while I decide on all the positioning. And then when I'm all done and I'm happy with the way everything looks, I'll knot those off and finalize the look. And like I said, I'll do a kissing, needle kissing knot, or any other thing really works, you know, around, and then through to create your knot. So however you want to do it. So I've attached the first one at the base there, and then I might come in and say I wanted this feather to stick out away from the hat. I might then tie the second one off further out onto the brim to create angle, any angle that I want to go with. So if I can then attach that second one and pivot that feather in the desired direction. So that's how I would attach these larger ones at this articulation point, and then make a decision about where you want to put the second one to achieve the desired look.
So there's been a question. What do you mean by a kissing knot?
You take the, I think I saw that on, somebody said it, that's what it was called on a video, but it's just where you wrap around your needle and then slide it through. You know, the thread's still attached, and then you slide it through. A fishing knot probably too. Like I think you use it when you go fishing, when you're attaching the tackle.
I've seen that for French knots too. Okay.
Yeah. Cross stitchers call those French knots, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah,
that is a good way to just tie it off. You can also just like a shoe, like if you're a child making a big shoe knot, that also works so for attaching it. So that's how I would attach those longer feathers. And I have some drawings on my blog post about ideas and angles for attaching those, so you can get more there. So that's how I might do those. And it's basically the same thing for when you have a feather that has a felt attachment. You're just going to stitch it right into the hat in your desired direction that you want to go. Or you can just pin it if you only had one or two feathers and you weren't worried about the pins. And then the last example of how to attach would be these. And these can be a lot of fun because you can just stitch those right onto your hat in your desired direction. So say if you were looking for a situation where it went kind of straight up along the crown, you could then sew those into it. And you can sandwich it in between layers as well. Like if you were planning something out and you already knew what you were up to, you could sandwich those into your layers as you were making your hat. So that's a lot of fun as well, and gives you a lot of options. But you can, like say if you were doing a large talabre and you had two sections, you could then sew those in between the two and catch them. Another note is some people have really good old tough sewing machines, and sometimes tough older sewing machines can sew right through, like a very small feather, like a rooster feather, and you can actually attach that with a machine to your tape, although extreme caution because breaking needles or, you know, any number of bad things could happen to your machine. So that's only, like I had an old Kenmore and I was fine with doing that with my old Kenmore. Now I have a computerized machine and I would never do that because it would never talk to me again. So, and some more examples. So that's how I would start attaching those to the hats. And I have a picture showing the lining, and I wanted to kind of give you an idea what I mean when oh my gosh, there's dog hair all over this bad boy. When I say without the lining, so here's a hat I made, and I just used a felt blank, and this is without lining yet. I haven't decided what I'm doing with this particular hat yet. Like I might redo my feathers. So there's no lining in it. So you can see all the places I've tied in feathers without the liner inside of it, right? So they're just tied directly in there. And if you look, they go all the way around the hat. And each one is not coming out. Like I can take a full wind. So as I'm planning it, I'm deciding what I'm going to do when I style it. So that allows, because I didn't have a liner in there, I can reset it, make a decision, and then put in a lining. Now, this is an example of one that I've lined. You can see I do this thing where I create a band and then I attach the inside of the liner. So this is tied, just unfortunately not a good example because it's all in black. This is just tied directly on this inside part of the. So there you can see the ties as I finalize it. I don't even mind then showing, this is another example where I did linen on the inside as a liner of the hat. And so I'm still trying to make decisions about what I'm up to with this particular hat. So you can see all the ties in it. I haven't finished yet. When I'm done, I'll cut any remaining and then it'll be set and styled and ready to go. So this particular one, I haven't quite finished styling it yet, but that gives you an idea. And I mean, the feathers don't go anywhere. You don't lose your feathers. And you can imagine putting a pin in each one of these feathers could be painful. There are other techniques where they describe attaching them to wires and then putting the wires around on the hat. I'm not going into that because I don't have a lot of experience with it, but it does exist out there. And I do have links on my little blog post that'll point you to some more interesting places. So now you've attached all these feathers. What do? Like, you look like a rooster that got roughed up. Well, you got to style them. And so that's kind of the second part of my little demo today, is how to style some of these. I'm not going to go too far because other creators have done some brilliant work on this and really gone into historically accurate early 16th century like ways in which they decorated feathers. So you can always visit the links that I provide on my blog page to go and see more of those. There's people who have done a lot of great work, but if you're in a hurry and you're trying to get this done, what are you going to do? Well, one of the main methods is just shaping your feather manually. And you'd be surprised how much bend and turn to your feather you can get by just manually massaging the shaft or the rachis to get what you desire. You can also wet them, dampen them to shape them in some desired way. Mainly, I'll just get a hold of them. And then I will go back and style them some more. So another thing you can do, like I mentioned, these little dull, kind of sad looking little drabs earlier that are in this natural. And of course my iron turned off. Let's give that a second. So you can also style feathers by using heat from curling irons or flat irons as well. I have my flat irons on. So I own these hair products. I don't think I've ever once used them on my hair. So you can take it. And now you can really get some really neat shapes. And that, they have found tools and stuff that were used for shaping fabric and stuff from the 16th century. So it's not beyond the pale that they had some ironing tools special for creating certain looks. And they are supported in the documentation. They did a lot, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, they did a lot of decoration of feathers on their caps. So curling iron or flat iron is great. Note for anybody who is a seamstress or a tailor, they work wonderful for fabric as well. So it's a good thing. If you ever need to straighten a lapel real quick, you can just take out a flat iron and voila, without ironing the whole thing. So they're great. They're great to have in the craft room. Let's see if my curling iron heat up, because usually that's a fun example. So the curling iron really gets a nice spin. I did one earlier. I can show you that one. So there's a curling iron. So you can see even if you had broken feathers, say you had some ostrich feathers that broke, it wasn't unheard of to then take, just one end of those and then style those and attach just the end tip and the separate together, but you give treatment to curling them and then add them to that. I don't know if this is going to be warm enough. I've heard people say, oh, they really like Marcel irons, which if you don't know what those are, it's okay. They're just like a special curling iron that has two flat ends to it that you turn it instead of the spring-loaded curler. And so I'm just gonna go around that. I'm not gonna do too incredibly hot. I would always test it first to make sure before I did anything, I wouldn't want to burn feathers. And you can see you can get some pretty nice looking curls to your feathers. So that's two of the main ways I style it. Just get a hold of it with my hands, or I might use an iron to achieve my desired look. The other thing that you've seen, if you've looked at any late 15th century, 16th century paintings and later, is you'll see a lot of times these will be curled. And it turns out that the barblets on the barbs of a ostrich feather will behave like ribbon, and you can just curl them directly using a pair of scissors or a blade. And you would do that just several barbs at a time, so that you so it takes a while, but you would just pick just a couple at a time, because you wouldn't want to rip too many of them out if you get a little bit carried away. So I have a scissors I use for that. And you're just going to treat them like ribbon. And then you've achieved this really curly, if you guys can see there. And then you can do that down the whole length of the ribbon, and it creates this really beautiful look. So then you can curl it with a curling iron to achieve the spiral. And then you could then curl each of the little barbs with a curling iron and get these. You've seen them probably in the paintings, you know, in the hats, you see these poofs and you're like, how did they pull that off? Well, this is one of the possible ways in which it's suggested that it was achieved. And so I've seen these decorated with beads, with anglets on the ends, and with gold, like gold dip, like along the shaft of the feather. So there's a lot of options if you're creating late 15th century, 16th century pieces might call for those, as well as some earlier. I have talked with people before that are doing a little bit earlier, like medieval, and they might have some, a feather that they have in their cap. And there's ways that you can use some of these techniques to style those as well. So my suggestion is, if you're going to get into this, so you can definitely visit the other the links that I've provided, visit my blog, and always feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about this sort of stuff and just kind of geeking out on it.
Do the feathers ever uncurl? Like, because we live in Texas and there's heat and humidity and it's horrible.
You can get rained on and lose like some of the heat treatments. You're not gonna lose. I haven't ever lost, like, I haven't done a terrible amount of this, but I've never lost this. But I have, like, I maintenance my hats, like every year I'll pull them out and adjust them. Because another technique that I do, if I'm dealing with a whole bunch of wing feathers like this, if I don't maintenance this particular hat, I can't see when I wear it. So I do occasionally maintenance this hat. I'll just take it out, I'll put it on a dummy, I'll retie some of the clusters to make sure they're sticking together. Like, it is due, this one has been sitting in a hat box, it's due for some curling and a little bit of attention to make sure it all stays in the same direction. And this one I usually pin this particular one to the top of my cap. And so I will take it out and just kind of do a maintenance, and I'll get my curling iron out and I'll retreat it. This particular hat is worn by a child, and you can see it lives through through being worn by a child to an event. So she can go and just, I mean, there's no being careful with it, and it will survive her attentions to it. So I really like this method for that reason, and I don't have to worry about her hurting herself by touching her hat. I would hate for her to poke her hand or something like that if I had just pinned them in. Also, another neat thing is I actually dyed those. Feathers will take, the blue and the gold feathers will take wool dye. If you have a dye concoction that, like an acid dye that's appropriate for wool, you just have to be careful though, because you can damage the barblets, like they lose some of their foofiness and they'll get smooth on you. So you do have to be aware of that. But I do occasionally, if I'm dyeing wool, I will dip my feathers in there real quick and dye them to match the outfit. So I'm working on an outfit that is probably way too matchy, but but it will have those colors in it, and so it'll all just kind of tie together. And it shouldn't probably match, but I love the matchy. So
What if you've got a hat that's already constructed and maybe say like out of leather or something?
so leather,
Still the same techniques?
I would want to be careful with leather because you don't want to damage it when you're, so small, appropriate size needles, don't go too big, then you could probably just do individual feathers and just have 2 points of connection and that's it. I would be very careful with puncturing leather. I don't have a lot of experience with leather. Like primarily I've worked in just with the cloth hats, but I have done these in like straw hats and it works as well. You can tie feathers into straw hats, works just fine. You can also do feathers, and like if you wanted to do a reef or something, you can tie that all into your straw hat as well. Just going between the weave, you just go between it instead of kind of puncturing through it. But with leather, I would probably consult with somebody who specializes in leather, and then find out what they would recommend for piercing it. Like that would be my only concern, is I would hate to see somebody damage or mess up the integrity of a hat. But if you had any like stitch points that already existed on a hat, you could leverage those. Like take a needle, go through the stitch point and grab it in the stitches, and then you don't have to worry about puncturing the leather. So I might consider that for if I was dealing with like a solid leather hat. I'd be worried I wouldn't want to ruin it, so.
I know there was an earlier question about your sourcing for your feathers. You went through at the beginning, but it sounds like you probably have a lot more information on that.
Yeah, I've used several sources, but the one that I like the most is a California wholesaler. And but you have to order like $100 worth of feathers. So get a buddy or end up with a lot of, I don't know if you can see that large basket back there. That is just full of feathers. So I went in by myself. I really wanted these, and this was the only way that I could get these particular. I love these natural. They call them chinchilla feathers. I don't know why. They're not from a chinchilla, or there's something that looks like that. The word does. So I might be murdering a language. It's entirely possible. So I love these feathers. I couldn't buy them from anywhere else. And so I wanted to buy some of these. So I just added on. I picked a random where I let them send me whatever they had in stock, which is incredibly cheap. And they just send you and you get a wide array, and which is kind of fun because it turns out, like I know some people that really, I know someone who she really likes these colors. So I was able to put that in her hat, which is a little bit of a stretch if you're going for like, very accurate. You're going to then want to consider colors based upon what's accurate for the time period. They did have, like I said, anything that takes to wool will take to a feather. So you can kind of think of it along those lines, what colors would have been available for whatever period or region you're dealing with. If it's available in wool or in some animal appropriate dye combinations, then it's appropriate for the feather of the time. Yeah, they can also paint them as well. So I mean, gold, it's not uncommon. Like I said, some of the links I provided at the bottom have like beautiful examples from the history of fashion of Mathis. I can't say his last name properly. He basically documented his outfits every day for like 20 years in paintings, and it was his own personal diary. So if you ever want to see, early 16th century, what is now, Southern Germany style, for men, he documented it daily. So he has these beautiful feather plumes with anglets and gold and beads, and they're lovely. So that's a definitely good, yeah, pink was achievable. So definitely. So if you decide to order feathers, you could always ask like 2 other people and then go in together, and then you get like a big box of feathers together. Or if you're just feeling like you want a supply of feathers to last forever, you can do that too. It's worked out for me. I've made you can see I make a lot of hats, and I've made a lot of hats, and I'll continue to do so. And I've never had to go, oh, I need feathers. I will never need feathers. And another idea is if you're in a pinch, this is a feather dust. These are feather duster feathers from just like Walmart. And they work. If you decorate them and make them pretty, they come out really nice. So if you're on a budget and in a hurry and desperate, you can always get feathers. Or the other thing that I've done is I've robbed arrangements from hobby stores, where they do their arrangement and then they put it on sale for like 60% off. You just take the arrangement and just rip the feathers and then put those in whatever you want. Great. So that's also an option for getting feathers, because they can be very expensive. But I can tell you, I don't ever lose feathers, and I always reuse. Like once I own them until they brittle away and die. And for some reason in Texas, I have not had a problem with any mites. I haven't had any big, whatever, however I store them, I put them up in a closet, appears to be perfectly adequate for storing them. So for me, it was a worthwhile investment of lots of fun and good times.